Welcome to Lesson 5, Identity and Access Management. This is our end of lesson exam review. So we covered a wide variety of topics in the Identity and Access Management domain. We started with talking about access control fundamentals. This is when you were first introduced to the concept of objects and subjects. It's also where we emphasize that access control happens across the entire enterprise. We then looked at identification and how we identify a subject. And in doing that, we looked at directory services, we looked at LDAP, we looked at single sign-on, we looked at federation, and we looked at identity as a service. We then went to authentication. Authentication is how you prove your identity. We talked about multi-factor and multi-layer or just single-factor authentication. We also looked at the various factors of what you know, what you have, and what you are. We then looked at our credential systems, which are how we implement authentication, and we looked at Kerberos, and we looked at Sesame, and we looked at Federation, and we discussed what a credential management system could do. Over into access and authorization criteria, this is where we first started talking about rights and permissions and privilege and least privilege and need to know, default, allow and deny, segregation of duties, and dual control. In our access models, we looked at DAC and MAC and RBAC. That was discretionary access control, mandatory access control, and role-based access control. We then followed that up with additional access control techniques, which included rule-based access control, content-based access control, context-based access control, and constrained interfaces. We brought that all together in our identity and access provisioning, where we talked about the workflow of both creating accounts all the way through assigning identity, assigning credentials, assigning permissions, getting agreements, doing user training, doing audit of activity and reviews, reviewing changes, re-auditing again, and then finally to revocation, so what the entire cycle is. So those are the topics that we covered in the identity and access management domain. So let's go ahead and do some questions together. Again, our goal of the questions is to both get you the answers, but more importantly, to talk about how you might approach these questions. So a blank is an entity being accessed or the item being acted upon. A blank is an active entity that requests access to an object or to the data within an object. So as we talked about before, when you get these fill-in-the-blank questions, a good way to start is just read it through and see if you can fill in the blank before you even start looking at the answers. Sometimes the answers can trip you up and put ideas in your mind. So read it through, and if you feel confident about what the answers are, then go ahead and look for those answers, making sure you still read all your choices. If you don't, let's start looking for some keywords. So our keywords here might be an entity being accessed or being acted upon, so being acted on. And then our second one is the active entity that is requesting. In the first case, we have an entity that's being accessed on or being acted upon, and the second we're saying an active entity. So we have our options of user object, user subject, object user, and object subject. So hopefully when these came up, you're like, well, wait a minute, no, we were always talking about objects and subjects, so I really should only be looking at objects and subjects. Because while a user is a subject, that's not the terminology or the phrase that we use. So because we don't, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. I'm going to get rid of A and B because both of them are using the term user. Actually, I can get rid of C because that's using it as well. So let's see if D works. An object is an entity being accessed or being acted upon. A subject is the active entity that requests access to an object or data within an object, and that is the correct answer. Even if perhaps you couldn't remember this when you were first looking at it, by remembering key concepts like we talked about object subjects, we didn't use the term user, that'll really help you get to the right answer. In question 2, which of the following is not an authorization model? So again, not is the key word here, and we want to make sure you're looking at this one, authorization. It's easy to read these fast and get the wrong term. So you could read authorization as authentication or accounting or accountability. So go slow when you're reading your questions. So which of the following is not an authorization? Now, authorization relates to rights and permissions. DAC, discretionary access control, and ACL, access control lists, MAC, mandatory access control, and RBAC, role-based access control. And remember, it's saying which is not. Well, DAC, discretionary access control, is. And we know that MAC, mandatory access control, is. And we know that RBAC, role-based access control. So our answer here is going to be an access control list. Now, an access control list is a technique, right? It is how we implement our authorization models, but it was not a model itself. So another way to look at this is that you know that these three, MAC, RBAC, and DAC, are similar. They're really the same. So ACL would be the one that's not like the other. In question 3, which of the following best describes LDAP? Again, we want best is the word and describes. Those are really important keywords for us. A directory service based on X.500 standards, Microsoft Active Directory, an authentication model, a cloud-based service. This is a tough one because you could almost make the case for any of these. Best describes LDAP. Well, it is a directory service and it is based on X.500 standards. So that's a really good high-level definition of LDAP. Now, Microsoft Active Directory is an implementation of LDAP, but it's Microsoft's implementation of LDAP. An authentication model? Well, you know, we use it for identity and authentication, but it's not a particularly complete description of LDAP. A cloud-based service, I suppose that LDAP could be used in the cloud, but again, it's not a really good description of LDAP. So while you might look at this and say, wow, LDAP could really relate to all of these, you want to go up to the highest level you can, the one that best describes the term. So in this case, we would choose A. It is a directory service based on X.500 standards. Again, not using Active Directory authentication or cloud-based, not because it couldn't possibly be right, but because they don't best describe LDAP. In question 4, which statement below best describes the measurement used to indicate biometric accuracy? Now, this is going to be a good example of trying to trip you up. Type A errors equal type B errors, false positives greater than false negatives, type 1 errors equal type 2 errors, or crossover acceptance rate, CAR. So here's where you may get tripped up on this one. We know that the biometric accuracy rate is based on crossover error rate, which is CER. But if you were reading quickly, you might look at crossover acceptance rate or just say, oh, what was it? EAR, AR? And you might choose that one, which would be incorrect. We want to remember that it's when our two types of errors match or are equal. So that's going to be false positives or less than false negatives. And now this is becoming a matter of you really needed to know it. Type A errors equal type B errors, type 1 errors equal type 2 errors, and the answer in this case is going to be C, when our type 1 errors equal our type 2 errors. That was our crossover error rate. Our false positives equaled our false negatives. And our last question here. Blank is the practice of having more than one subject required to complete a specific task. Blank is the breaking down of a process into tasks that are assigned to different subjects so that no one subject is in complete control. Blank is the principle of not assigning more rights or permissions than necessary. Now here you're seeing this in a narrative format. You also might see this question in a drag and drop where you have to drag the right answer over, or you might even see it in matching, the same way we've been doing our matching at the end of each lesson. So my approach with these, first I read it, I try to fill in the blanks myself, see if I say, okay, yep, I know this, I got it. And if not, then I'm going to start reading through the answers to see if maybe something triggers my memory or helps me recall what I'm supposed to be answering or how I'm supposed to be answering it. But even if I think I have the right answer at the beginning, I always read all 4 answers. Don't ever skip reading an answer. So let's try these. The first one says, dual control is a practice of having more than one subject required to complete a specific task. Separation of duties is the breaking down of a process into tasks that are assigned to different subjects so that no one subject is in complete control. And least privilege is the principle of not assigning more rights or permissions than necessary. I really like that. Dual control, the practice of having more than one subject required to complete a specific task. I always had the vision in my mind of we need 2 keys to open up a vault. Separation of duties, the breaking down of a process into tasks that are assigned to different subjects so no one subject is in complete control. And least privilege, the principle of not assigning more rights or permissions than necessary. But even though I like A, I'm not going to stop here. I am going to read it. The next one is separation of duties is having more than one subject required to complete a task. Need to know is the breaking down of a process into tasks that are assigned. No, that's not need to know. We can get rid of that one right away. Mandatory access control is the process of having more than one subject required to complete a specific task. No, we know that that's not right, so we're going to move on. And dual control is the practice of having more than one subject required to complete a task. Yeah, we do like that. Separation of duties is the breaking down of a process into tasks that are assigned to different subjects so no one subject is in complete control. No, we still like that. That's like A, dual control and separation of duties. Anti-aggregation is the principle of not assigning more rights or permission than necessary. That's a total made-up term in this case. So it would be important that you know that least privilege is a principle that we want to follow always in information security. So A and D, the first 2 parts are similar. It's least privilege versus anti-aggregation. Anti-aggregation is a made-up term. Don't let it fool you. That's going to give us A as our correct answer. I hope going through these questions help you. It's really important for me that you understand how to address these. I want you to do great on that exam. So thanks for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next domain.